was pretty much gone within a year or so. And then you were just, oh God, how long is this going to last? So I think people were happy to go home. So that's what paroling means. You just go home and you're out. Exchanging is very simple. Let's say, I think Scott and I talked about this in one of the episodes, but let's say Scott and I are two generals and we're fighting each other. And afterward, I end up with 100 Confederate prisoners and he ends up with 100 Union prisoners. I just switched our sides, didn't I, Scott? Oh, well, work with me.
Whatever.
So they would trade prisoners on a 1-for-1 basis, but it wasn't always strictly 1-for-1 because a private was like 1 point. Okay. You think about chess, a pawn is 1, a bishop is 3, a rook is 5, and so on. Queen is 9. So like a private was worth 1, a corporal or a sergeant might be 2 or 3, and you get up to generals. So like one general would be worth 50 or 100 privates. I forget the exact numbers. It doesn't matter. But so they would just swap out prisoners, and then there was no need to parole or have prison camps. But the system of parole and exchange began to break down in 1863. Anybody remember why? Anyone? Bueller?
Let's see what the lag time is on our comment section.
Yeah. All right. Come on. Comment. Scott will send you $100 if you get this right.
I'll send you a flashing icon image of a trophy. That's worth a lot.
Wow, that's great. All right, I'll go ahead and answer. It was when African American soldiers began to be used by the Union because the Confederates would not trade. They would not exchange them or parole them because they said these are not soldiers; these are runaway slaves, and the people leading them are not leading battles; they're leading slave insurrections. I'm sure most of our viewers have seen the movie Glory. And if you haven't, what's wrong with you? Go watch it right now after this video. But in Glory, they show the Colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, played by Matthew Broderick. They show him reading out a proclamation by the Confederate Congress. And it's not word for word, but it's pretty close to what the real proclamation said. And it said it probably said Negro. Any Negro caught bearing arms against the South will be sold back into slavery, and any officer leading Negro troops into battle will be considered as a leader of a slave insurrection and will be executed. So they would not exchange, and that's when you started having both sides taking prisoners. And they still had a few prisoner exchanges, but it finally completely got shut down in 1864 when General Grant, when he was in charge of the whole Union Army, he just ended it unilaterally because it was part of his strategy of attrition. He said, every prisoner that we keep, if we don't give them back, then that's one less soldier the Confederacy has. And it was all about trying to whittle down the Confederate Army and get them because they were running out of guys. People were deserting. People were just losing their morale. People were starving. There was disease. So Grant knew, even if it meant that some Union soldiers had to suffer in Confederate prisons, he knew that in the long run that benefited the North. Does that make sense? I don't know if I explained that clearly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It's kind of like the same thing when he would go like attack Robert E. Lee, and he'd lose 5,000 guys, and Lee would lose 4,000, and people said, "You're a butcher," but he would say, "Hey, but losing those people hurts him more than it hurts me." But I want to just briefly talk about the prison camps. By the end of the war, there were about 400,000 prisoners, and of these 400,000, 56,000 died. And that's an awful lot. Prisons in general were awful, awful places to be. It was bad enough to be in a battle, but almost every Civil War prison, some were better than others, but they were all bad. The prisoners suffered from overcrowding, meager rations, poor sanitation, even worse than in regular army camps, sometimes sadistic treatment by the guards, and of course, disease. And I want to highlight just 3 of the most famous, or I should say notorious, prison camps. And the first is Camp Douglas in Illinois. It was called the Andersonville of the North. We'll talk about the real Andersonville in a minute, but Camp Douglas originally served as a training facility for Illinois regiments, but it was later converted to a prison camp. 18,000 Confederates were incarcerated there by the end of the war. Upon inspecting the camp, the U.S. Sanitary Commission reported that and this is a quote, "The amount of standing water, of unpoliced grounds, of foul sinks, of general disorder, of soil reeking with miasmic accretions," I love that phrase, of rotten bones and emptying of camp kettles was enough to drive a sanitarian mad. That's the end of the quote. The barracks were so filthy and infested that the commission claimed, quote, "nothing but fire can cleanse them." That sounds kind of biblical, doesn't it? Union camp leadership was largely to blame for the death toll. Commandants purposely cut ration sizes and quality for personal profit, leading to illness, scurvy, and starvation. 1 prisoner in 7 died for a total of 4,200 deaths by 1865. That's Camp Douglas. Another really bad Union prison camp was Elmira Prison in New York State. Elmira, also known as Hellmira, opened in July of 1864. It quickly became famous for its staggering death rate, its unfathomable living conditions, and for its sadistic commandant, Colonel William Hoffman. Colonel Hoffman forced Confederate prisoners to sleep outside in the open while furnishing them with little to no shelter. Prisoners relied upon their own ingenuity for constructing drafty and largely inadequate shelters consisting of sticks, blankets, and logs. As a result, the rebels spent their winters shivering in biting cold and their summers in sweltering, pathogen-laden heat. Overcrowding was yet again a major problem. Although Union leadership mandated a ceiling of 4,000 prisoners at Elmira within a month of its opening, that number had swelled to 12,000. So within a month, there were three times as many people as there were supposed to be. By the time the last prisoners were sent home in September of 1865, close to 3,000 men had perished. With a death rate approaching 25%, Elmira was one of the deadliest Union-operated POW camps of the entire war. So those are 2 in the north. And then just very quickly, you had Belle Isle in Virginia, which was really bad. But the worst overall the worst prison camp on either side was a Confederate camp, Andersonville. There's a whole movie. Salud, take a drink. There's a movie about Andersonville that you can watch the whole movie on YouTube for free. At least you used to be able to. It's not a great movie, but it's definitely worth watching. In the 14 months of his existence, 45,000 prisoners were received at Andersonville Prison, and of these, nearly 13,000 died. Captain Henry Weirs, commandant at Andersonville, was executed as a war criminal for not providing adequate supplies and shelter for the prisoners. By the way, he was the only Confederate who was executed as a war criminal. So no Robert E. Lee, no Jefferson Davis, but this one captain. Kind of think he was a scapegoat, but that's just my opinion. Modern interpretation of the evidence suggests that they did face real supply shortages. There were simply too many prisoners and not enough food, clothing, medicine, or tents to go around. Limited rations consisting of cornmeal, beef, and or bacon resulted in extreme vitamin C deficiencies, which oftentimes led to deadly cases of scurvy. In addition to the high frequency of scurvy, many prisoners endured intense bouts of dysentery, which further weakened their frail bodies. Prisoners at Andersonville also made matters worse for themselves by relieving themselves where they gathered their drinking water. It's nasty to think of. Resulting in widespread outbreaks of disease, and by forming into gangs for the purpose of beating or murdering weaker men for food, supplies, and booties. They show that in that movie I was mentioning. One prisoner, commenting on the daily death toll and foul conditions, proclaimed, "I walk around camp every morning looking for acquaintances, the sick, etc., and I can see a dozen most any morning laying around dead. A great many are terribly afflicted with diarrhea, and scurvy begins to take hold of some." And just a little bit more. The nature of the deaths and the reasons for them are a continuing source of controversy. While some historians contend that the deaths were chiefly the result of deliberate action or inaction on the part of Captain Weirs, others posit they were the result of disease promoted by severe overcrowding. Andersonville was more than 8 times over capacity at its peak. 8 times.
Wow.
The shortage of food in the Confederate States and the refusal of Union authorities to reinstate the prisoner exchange are also cited as contributing factors. Despite the controversy, there can be little doubt that Andersonville was the Civil War's most infamous and deadly prison camp. However, the issues raised by Andersonville were shared by many camps on both sides. And I'll say this, as Sherman's soldiers were doing their march across Georgia, they ran across Andersonville. They went to Andersonville and they discovered the men there. And some of these men look like living skeletons. If y'all want, Google.
I've seen the
Andersonville prisoner, and they look like the Jews after the that were liberated from concentration camps.
The pictures of the people, you cannot possibly imagine how a person could be alive and be that thin, and even recover after they start to eat or drink again. But they're I think pushed to the absolute extreme end of what the human body can endure with no nutrition whatsoever.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was a lot to take in there.
My source on that, but if you want to read more, it's the American Battlefield Trust. It's an amazing organization, and if I was a wealthy man, I'd give them lots of money. But they fight to keep our battlefields preserved, and they also have great videos on YouTube. Like there's a whole series called Civil War in 4 minutes, and I use some of those as sources. Civil War, you can 4 minutes about the Battle of Bull Run, 4 minutes on Gettysburg, or sometimes it's 10 minutes or 15, but they're really great. So I highly recommend them. They have them for the Revolution too.
Yeah. When you were describing the POW camps, and then earlier when you were mentioning that people would desert, we think, how could they do that? Well, considering how terrible the conditions were, it's reasonable, or they were allowed free to go by the Union. Well, anyway, what made me think of this is a difficulty a lot of people have when they consider historical wars is World War II casts an incredibly long shadow on any type of battle we look at, even in antiquity. And I mean, World War II completely, it created the world in which we live in. It was total war on a scale we haven't seen. But the problem is, in many ways, World War II is an anomaly. One of them is that I don't think there's a more black and white, good versus evil, especially if you look in the Western theater of, you have Nazis, you have Adolf Hitler. There's no better villain, in a war. Mm-hmm. But the vast bulk of history, that's not simply how it works. Are you fired up about World War I in the same way? I mean, explain World War II. How do you explain it? Oh, Nazis, Hitler, world domination. Okay, gotcha. World War I. Well, you see, this was a reconfiguration of the post-Napoleonic order that was crumbling, and you already lost people. But the point being that the reasons are harder to describe. There are definitely passions and leadership roles, and for boots on the ground. But then there are also many people who they're not as completely sold out to the cause, and their reasons for fighting are a little bit more ambiguous. It's not like the, Midwestern boy who immediately goes to the draft office after Pearl Harbor bombing. I mean, for the Civil War, yes, there were people who had inflamed passions. If you were an African-American fighting, I bet you really cared about winning. If you were a Southerner who thought your homeland was under attack, then that was something. But there were many other people who had many mixed feelings. So you could see, maybe some overlap with the Vietnam War, for example. And you made me think of the Hanoi Hilton with some of those descriptions of POW camps.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
Okay, I just want to jump into one last thing here. I'm going to set this up, and then I want to hear your opinion, James. And this is Civil War monuments. So somebody asked, what do you think about the removal of Confederate monuments in the South and renaming of streets? So,
look at the time. I'm sorry. I gotta go.
Okay. So what I'm going to
My
do
take,
is...
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So first, let me just kind of do my best to give justice to the two sides. I'll just give my take first. Okay. So I'm a Northerner. I wouldn't, want a Confederate monument in my hometown. But that's just on the local level. But my opinion is that I don't think that these issues should be nationalized, and it should be up to the community itself to decide. There are some historical figures where I think are irredeemable, and you shouldn't have a statue of them, like a Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin should not have a statue. But then there are other people who are much more complicated. And if isolating one part of their trait can be tricky. So just one short example is, recently I saw in the news that a college campus removed a statue of a historical figure. And the justification was that students found all these racist quotes that he said and thought that he didn't belong in the modern world. James, can you guess who this person was?
Woodrow Wilson?
It was
It
was Mahatma Gandhi.
Oh, no way.
So at the University of Ghana,